There are nights that live in your bones long after they're over. This was one of them. I remember the blue light from the television painting everything in our living room like we were underwater. Malcolm and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, the same couch we'd claimed as neutral territory when I moved in 8 months earlier. The same couch where we'd shared pizza and argued about movies and pretended we were just two guys splitting rent in Chicago. Nothing more complicated than that. It was late March, one of those nights when spring feels like a promise the city isn't ready to keep. The windows were cracked open just enough to let in the sound of distant traffic and the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The apartment felt smaller than usual, filled with the weight of something neither of us knew how to name. Malcolm had been different for weeks. Quieter. He'd come home from his sound design projects and disappear into his room, or sit exactly where he was sitting now, staring at nothing. I'd catch him sometimes, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands, looking like he'd forgotten what he was supposed to do next. I wanted to ask. I should have asked. But we'd built our friendship on the comfortable distance between asking and knowing, and I didn't want to be the one to cross that line. The television was showing some late-night movie neither of us cared about. I wasn't even sure what channel it was. The volume was low enough that the dialogue felt like background noise, like voices from another room. Malcolm shifted beside me, and I could feel the couch cushions give way under his weight. That's when he said it. "I don't feel anything anymore." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like he was reading from a grocery list. Not desperate or broken or asking for pity, just stating something he'd finally figured out about himself. I turned to look at him then. Really look at him. His profile was sharp against the television light, all angles and shadows. His dark hair was longer than usual, curling slightly at the edges. He'd been forgetting to get it cut. He'd been forgetting a lot of things lately. I wanted to say something. Anything. But what do you say to someone who's just told you they've gone numb? What do you offer someone who can't feel? He turned toward me then, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not happiness, not sadness, but recognition. Like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in a long time. "Can you help me feel something?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I felt my chest tighten, felt something shift in the space we'd so carefully maintained. This wasn't about friendship anymore. This wasn't about being good roommates or splitting bills or pretending we didn't notice the way the apartment felt different when the other person wasn't home. I heard everything in those words. The loneliness, the desperate need for connection, the trust it took to ask me, of all people, to be the one to bring him back to himself. But I also heard the danger in it, the way it could change everything between us, the way it already had. I swallowed hard and nodded. Just once. Barely perceptible. But he saw it. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. It pressed against my ribs, made it hard to breathe. I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, could hear Malcolm's breath as he stared at me with something that might have been hope. We didn't move. Neither of us knew what came next. Days later, I would stand in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, staring at my own reflection and trying to understand what had passed between us that night. Trying to decode the weight of that silence, the meaning behind his question, the significance of my answer. But in that moment, on that couch, with the television light dancing across our faces and the promise of rain in the air, all I knew was that something had changed. Something fundamental and irreversible. And I was terrified of how much I wanted it to. I should tell you how we ended up here. How two men in their 30s came to share this small apartment on the north side of Chicago, orbiting each other like planets that never quite align. My name is Julian Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and I teach American history to 16-year-olds who think the Civil War happened sometime around when their parents were born. I'm the kind of teacher who wears the same 3 sweaters in rotation, who stays late to help students who won't ask for it, who comes home exhausted from caring too much about people who don't realize they need it. I moved in with Malcolm 8 months ago, after David and I ended things. Not in the explosive way relationships sometimes end, but in the quiet, inevitable way that hurt worse. 3 years together, and toward the end, we were like two people reading different books in the same room. Present but absent. David said I compartmentalized everything. He said I treated my emotions like lesson plans, filed away and organized until they lost all their meaning. He wasn't wrong. Malcolm Rhodes is 2 years older than me, though he carries himself like someone who's never quite decided what age he wants to be. He's a freelance sound designer, which means he spends his days in our converted bedroom-turned-studio, creating atmospheric soundscapes for indie films and podcasts. He has this way of listening to the world that makes you realize how much noise you've been ignoring. The hum of the radiator, the rhythm of footsteps in the hallway above us, the way silence has its own particular weight. When I first moved in, I was drawn to his detachment. After David's constant need to process and analyze and discuss, Malcolm's emotional distance felt like relief. He dated women occasionally, beautiful women with interesting careers who would appear for dinner and disappear by morning. He never seemed invested in any of them, never seemed hurt when they stopped calling. I told myself I envied that. The ability to want someone without needing them. The skill of keeping your heart at arm's length. Our apartment is a study in careful avoidance. It's sparse but lived in, filled with the small compromises of two people trying to make a home without getting too close. Coffee rings mark the wooden table between our separate sides of the couch. Half-dead plants sit on the windowsill, casualties of our shared inability to commit to anything that requires daily attention. There's a calendar on the refrigerator that neither of us updates, still showing February, even though March is nearly over. We've perfected the art of parallel living. Malcolm works during the day, headphones on, lost in the sounds he's creating. I grade papers at the kitchen table, red pen in hand, trying to help teenagers understand why history matters when I'm not sure I understand it myself. In the evenings, we occupy opposite ends of the couch, watching television we don't care about, eating takeout from containers that create a small barrier between us. It worked. This careful dance of proximity and distance. This illusion that two people could share space without sharing anything that mattered. Until that night. Until he asked me to help him feel something. Now I lie awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand why that moment has lodged itself so deep in my chest that I can barely breathe around it. Why the memory of his voice asking that question has become a constant low hum in the back of my mind, like a song I can't stop hearing. I watch him differently now. Notice things I used to file away as irrelevant details. The way his laugh has become thinner over the past few months, more performance than genuine response. The way he stands in front of the refrigerator for too long, like he's forgotten what he was looking for. The way he sleeps on the couch more often than in his own bed, curled up like he's trying to disappear. Depression, I realize, has been living in our apartment like a third roommate. Invisible but present, taking up space neither of us acknowledged. Malcolm has always been charismatic in the way that keeps people at exactly the right distance. Charming enough to be liked, elusive enough to avoid real intimacy. But lately, that charisma feels more like armor. A way of deflecting attention from whatever's happening underneath. I recognize it because I do the same thing. I've spent my entire adult life perfecting the art of being reliably present while remaining emotionally unavailable. It's served me well in classrooms full of teenagers who need stability more than they need my feelings. It served me less well with David, who needed both. But something about Malcolm's question that night has cracked something open in me. Something I've spent years keeping carefully contained. Why did it matter so much? Why did those 6 words rearrange everything I thought I understood about us, about myself, about the careful boundaries we'd constructed? I think about the way he looked at me when he asked. Not desperate, not pleading, but trusting. Like he genuinely believed I had something to offer. Like he saw something in me that I didn't know was visible. And I think about the way I nodded. Without hesitation. Without consideration for what I was agreeing to or what it might cost me. We still haven't talked about it. 3 days have passed, and we've returned to our usual rhythm of polite distance. But something has shifted. The air between us feels different, charged with a possibility neither of us knows how to name. I catch myself watching him when he's not looking, listening for him when he's in his studio, wondering what he's thinking when he stares out the window with that expression I can't read. This is dangerous territory for someone like me. Someone who has built his entire adult life around emotional safety. Someone who knows that caring too much about the wrong person can derail everything you thought you knew about yourself. But I can't seem to stop. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning while I was grading essays about the Great Depression. Malcolm knocked on my bedroom door, something he rarely did, and stood in the doorway holding his phone like it contained news he didn't know how to deliver. His sister was getting married in Maine, he said. This weekend. A small ceremony overlooking the ocean, family only. He'd been planning to bring someone, but she'd canceled last minute. Work emergency. He paused, ran his hand through his hair, and asked if I wanted to come instead. Just for the weekend, he said. Free food, open bar, seaside views. His voice carried that careful lightness he used when he was trying to sound casual about something that wasn't casual at all. I should have said no. Should have made up some excuse about lesson plans or papers to grade or the dozen other ways I could have avoided stepping outside the careful boundaries we'd established. But something in his voice stopped me. Something that sounded almost like he needed me there. So I said yes. The drive to Maine took 6 hours, most of it spent listening to music Malcolm had curated with the kind of attention he usually reserved for his professional projects. We talked about safe things. The changing leaves, even though it was too early for real autumn colors. The podcasts he was working on. My students and their creative interpretations of historical events. We didn't talk about that night on the couch. We didn't talk about the way the air between us had been different for the past week, charged with something neither of us knew how to name. The hotel was small and charming, the kind of place that existed primarily in brochures about coastal Maine. Our room had 2 beds and a view of the harbor, where fishing boats bobbed like toys in a bathtub. Malcolm claimed the bed by the window, then immediately apologized, as if he'd overstepped some boundary I hadn't known existed. It's fine, I told him, and it was fine, or it should have been fine. But lying in the dark that first night, listening to the sound of his breathing from the bed 6 feet away, I realized how carefully we'd avoided this kind of proximity. How intentionally we'd structured our shared life to maintain distance even while living in the same small space. The wedding was the next evening. Malcolm's family was warm and chaotic in the way that made me miss having siblings, miss the kind of easy intimacy that comes from shared history. His sister Emma was radiant in that particular way brides have, like she was lit from within. His parents treated me like I belonged there, like I was part of something instead of just someone filling an empty seat. The awkward moments came in small doses throughout the day. A great aunt who assumed we were a couple and complimented us on how well-matched we seemed. A cousin who asked how long we'd been together, then looked confused when Malcolm corrected him. Emma's maid of honor who winked at me during the reception and said Malcolm seemed happier than she'd seen him in years. Each time, Malcolm would deflect with that practiced charm, redirect the conversation, make a joke that wasn't quite a denial but wasn't quite a confirmation either. And each time, I felt something twist in my chest that I refused to examine too closely. The reception stretched late into the evening. We drank too much bourbon, danced with Emma and her new husband and various relatives who insisted we join them. Malcolm was magnetic in that way he could be when he wanted to be, drawing people to him effortlessly, making everyone feel like they were part of something special. But I watched him too. Saw the way his smile flickered sometimes when he thought no one was looking. Saw how he held himself just slightly apart even in the middle of a crowd. Back in our room, we sat on the small balcony overlooking the water, still wearing our wedding clothes, ties loosened, sleeves rolled up. The bourbon had made everything feel softer around the edges, more honest somehow. Malcolm leaned back in his chair and stared out at the dark ocean. The moon was almost full, casting a silver path across the water that looked like something you could walk on if you were brave enough. I don't remember the last time I cried, he said suddenly. His voice was quiet, matter of fact, like he was commenting on the weather. I waited for him to continue, but he didn't. Just sat there with his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands wrapped around his empty glass. I wanted to ask when he'd last tried. Wanted to ask what it felt like to be that disconnected from his own emotions. Wanted to ask if it scared him the way it scared me to watch. Instead, I just waited. He turned to look at me then, and something in his expression was different. more open than I'd seen him in months. The alcohol had stripped away some of his usual defenses, left him raw in a way that made my chest tighten. "But sometimes I think I could," he said. "Around you." The words hung in the salt air between us like a confession, like a question, like a door opening just wide enough to glimpse what was on the other side. That's when the storm hit. Not the kind of dramatic downpour you see in movies, but a steady Maine coastal storm that seemed to come from nowhere. The wind picked up, sending spray from the harbor across our balcony. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. We should have gone inside. Should have closed the sliding door and retreated to our separate beds and pretended this conversation hadn't happened. But we didn't move. We sat there getting soaked, letting the rain blur the careful lines we'd drawn around ourselves. Malcolm closed his eyes and tilted his face toward the sky like he was trying to wash something away. Or maybe trying to feel something wash over him. I wanted to reach out. Wanted to touch his hand, his shoulder, wanted to close the 3 feet of space between our chairs and tell him that whatever he was looking for, whatever he needed to feel, I understood. I wanted to tell him that I'd been numb too, in my own way. That I'd spent so many years protecting myself from feeling too much that I'd forgotten how to feel anything at all. But I didn't. I just stayed. Sat there in the rain watching him try to remember what it felt like to be human, what it felt like to want something besides the absence of pain. And somehow that was enough. The staying, the witnessing, the simple act of being present while he came apart and put himself back together in the space of a single breath. When we finally went inside, soaked and shivering, everything between us had changed. Not in a way we could name or talk about, but in a way that made the air itself feel different. Made the distance between our beds feel both too much and not nearly enough. I lay awake most of that night, listening to the storm move inland, thinking about the way he'd looked at me when he said he thought he could cry around me, thinking about what it meant that I was the person he trusted with that vulnerability, thinking about how much I wanted to be worthy of that trust, and how terrified I was of what that wanting might cost me. Coming back to Chicago felt like returning to a house where someone had rearranged all the furniture. Everything looked the same, but nothing fit quite right anymore. The couch where we'd had that first conversation, the kitchen table where we ate our careful meals in comfortable silence, the hallway that connected our separate bedrooms. All of it felt different now, charged with the memory of that night in Maine when Malcolm told me he thought he could cry around me. The air between us had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore and equally impossible to name. Malcolm began to linger, not in the obvious way that would have forced us to acknowledge what was happening, but in small moments that stretched just a beat too long. He'd stand in the kitchen while I made coffee in the morning, not saying anything, just present in a way he hadn't been before. He'd settle onto the couch in the evening and stay there, even after his usual shows ended, even when I was grading papers and the silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Sometimes I'd catch him outside my bedroom door, hand raised like he was about to knock. Then he'd see me watching and make some excuse about looking for his charger or wondering if I'd seen his keys. But his eyes would hold mine for just a moment too long, and I'd feel that familiar twist in my chest that I was becoming too familiar with. We started sharing music. It began innocently enough. Malcolm working in his studio with the door open, some ambient piece drifting into the living room that made me pause in whatever I was doing. I'd ask what it was, and he'd light up in a way I hadn't seen in months, eager to explain the layered sounds, the way silence could be just as important as noise. Soon he was making me playlists. Not romantic mixtapes like teenagers make for each other, but carefully curated collections of sounds and songs that felt like conversations we weren't having out loud. Late-night jazz that painted the apartment in blues and shadows. Electronic music that pulsed with the kind of longing that had no words. Folk songs about men who loved other men, about desire that couldn't be spoken, about the space between wanting and having. I'd listen to them while he was asleep, headphones on, and feel like I was reading his diary, like he was telling me things he couldn't say in daylight. The conversations began to deepen too. We'd find ourselves talking past midnight, sharing stories from our childhood that neither of us had spoken aloud in years. Malcolm told me about growing up feeling different, about the weight of being the kind of boy who preferred books to sports, who noticed things other boys didn't seem to see, about his parents' well-meaning attempts to make him more social, more traditionally masculine, more like the son they thought they were supposed to have. I told him about the year I spent convinced I was going to be a priest, about the relief and terror I felt when I realized I wanted something else entirely, about David, and the way our relationship had felt like wearing clothes that were almost the right size, comfortable enough most of the time, but never quite fitting the way they should. These conversations happened in the dark, usually both of us staring at the ceiling or out the window, as if eye contact would make the words too real, too dangerous. It was during one of these late-night talks that I realized I'd started watching him differently, not just listening to what he was saying, but studying the curve of his jaw when he spoke, the way his hands moved when he was trying to explain something complicated, the way he'd run his fingers through his hair when he was thinking, leaving it rumpled in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. Malcolm had started sleeping on the couch more often. He'd fall asleep there watching television, or after our late-night conversations, and I'd find him in the morning curled up under the throw blanket, still wearing yesterday's clothes. I told myself he was just comfortable there, that it didn't mean anything. But sometimes I'd get up for water in the middle of the night and find myself standing in the doorway of the living room, watching him sleep. The apartment would be silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft sound of his breathing. In sleep, his face would lose the careful control he maintained during the day, and I could see traces of the boy he must have been. Soft and unguarded and beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. I hated myself for watching him like that, for the way my heart would speed up when he'd shift in his sleep, when he'd make small sounds that might have been dreams or might have been something else entirely, for the way I'd noticed that he slept with his fists clenched, like even in unconsciousness he was fighting something. But I couldn't seem to stop. There was something about seeing him undefended that felt like a privilege I hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Malcolm had started saying goodnight to me differently too. Not just the casual night he used to throw over his shoulder as he headed to his room, but good night, Jules, spoken directly to me, with eye contact that lasted just a moment longer than friendship required. His voice would be softer when he said it, almost intimate, like he was practicing something he wasn't ready to say out loud. Each time, I'd feel something unfurl in my chest, something warm and terrifying and completely inappropriate for a man saying goodnight to his roommate. The power went out on a Thursday night in April, a spring storm that knocked out electricity to half the neighborhood, leaving us sitting in our apartment with nothing but the emergency candles I'd bought and forgotten about months earlier. We lit them and placed them around the living room, and suddenly our familiar space became something else entirely. Softer, more intimate, filled with shadows that moved and danced and made everything feel like a secret. We ended up on the floor, leaning against the couch, passing a bottle of wine between us and talking about the people we might have been if we'd made different choices. If I'd actually become a priest. If Malcolm had stayed in college instead of dropping out to chase his dream of making music out of silence. If either of us had been braver, more honest, more willing to risk the comfortable distance we'd built around ourselves. The conversation meandered the way conversations do when there's no artificial light to remind you what time it is, when the darkness makes everything feel possible and nothing feel quite real. That's when Malcolm told me about college. About a party during his sophomore year, before he dropped out, before he decided that formal education wasn't for him. He'd been drunk, he said, and there was this boy from his literature class. Someone he'd noticed, but never spoken to. Someone who seemed to understand the books they were reading in a way that made Malcolm feel less alone. They'd ended up talking on a balcony while the party continued inside. About Whitman and desire, and the way certain poems could make you feel like someone else had been living inside your head. And then, without planning it, without meaning for it to happen, Malcolm had kissed him. Just once, he said, brief and uncertain, and over before either of them could decide what it meant. The boy had kissed him back, but then pulled away, confused, apologetic. They'd never spoken about it afterward, never even made eye contact in class for the rest of the semester. Malcolm told this story to the candlelit air between us, not looking at me, his voice careful and steady like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. He said he'd never told anyone before. Not his sister, not his parents, not any of the women he'd dated. It was just this thing that had happened, this moment that existed outside the story he told about himself. I didn't react, didn't gasp or ask questions or make it about me in any way. I just nodded. The way you acknowledge any piece of someone's history, any small revelation that helps explain how they became who they are. But inside, something was clicking into place. Some piece of understanding that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Later, after we'd blown out the candles and gone to our separate beds, after the power had come back on and the apartment had returned to its normal harsh lighting, I lay awake thinking about that story, about the courage it had taken for him to tell me, and about what it might mean that he'd chosen me to tell. I thought about the way he'd been lingering lately, the playlists, the late-night conversations, the way he said my name like he was tasting something new. I thought about his confession in Maine, about thinking he could cry around me, about the trust implicit in that vulnerability. And I realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and inevitable, that I was falling in love with him. Not just attracted to him, though I was that too, in a way that made me feel like a teenager discovering desire for the first time, but actually genuinely in love. With his careful intelligence and his hidden vulnerability and the way he could create beauty out of silence. With the man who trusted me enough to share his pain and his history and his hopes for who he might become. The problem was, I wasn't sure Malcolm knew what he was asking for, what any of this meant, or where it could possibly lead. He was exploring something, testing boundaries, allowing himself to want things he'd never let himself want before. But I didn't know if what he wanted was me, specifically, or just the safety to want it all. And I was terrified that my feelings had grown too large, too complicated, too real for the delicate thing we were building between us. That loving him might be exactly the wrong response to his tentative steps toward feeling something again. But I couldn't seem to help it. He'd asked me to help him feel something, and somehow, in the process, he'd made me feel everything. I stayed late at school that night, helping a student with a research project about the Harlem Renaissance. By the time I got home, it was nearly 10 o'clock, and I expected to find the apartment dark, Malcolm already asleep on the couch or hidden away in his room. Instead, I found him in the kitchen, standing under the harsh fluorescent light, visibly drunk and holding something in his hands. As I got closer, I realized it was the framed photo Emma had given us at the wedding. The one where Malcolm and I are standing together during the reception, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something someone had just said. I'd forgotten about that photo. Emma had pressed it into my hands as we were leaving, insisting we looked too happy not to have a memento. I'd shoved it into my suitcase, and apparently Malcolm had found it when I wasn't paying attention, had it framed without telling me. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes unfocused but intense in the way that alcohol sometimes makes people. He held up the photo like evidence of something. "I looked happy here," he said. His words were slightly slurred, but his voice carried a weight that cut through the kitchen's bright lighting and made everything feel smaller, more intimate. He stared at the photo for a long moment, then looked directly at me. Was I? Happy, I mean. The question hung between us like smoke. I didn't know how to answer it. He had looked happy that day. We both had. There had been something easy about being together at the wedding, something natural about the way we'd moved through that celebration as a unit, letting people assume what they wanted to assume, not correcting their misunderstandings. But I didn't know if that happiness had been real or performed, didn't know if it had been about the moment or about the pretense, didn't know if it mattered either way. Before I could figure out what to say, Malcolm set the photo down on the counter and took a step toward me. Then another. The kitchen suddenly felt impossibly small, the distance between us charged with something that made the air hard to breathe. He reached up and touched my face, just briefly, his fingertips tracing along my jaw like he was trying to memorize the shape of it. His hand was warm and slightly unsteady, and I could smell bourbon on his breath, could see something desperate and uncertain in his eyes. I should have stepped back. I should have suggested he drink some water, get some sleep. Let whatever this was wait until morning when we could think clearly about what we were doing. Instead, I stood perfectly still and let him lean closer. The kiss was brief and tentative and nothing like I'd imagined it might be during all those late nights when I'd allowed myself to imagine it. His lips were soft but hesitant, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be doing this, wasn't sure what response he was hoping for. For a moment, just a moment, I kissed him back. Let myself feel the warmth of his mouth, the way his breath caught when I responded, the way his free hand came up to rest against my chest like he was checking to make sure my heart was still beating. But then he pulled away, sudden and sharp, like he'd just realized what he was doing. His eyes went wide with something that looked like panic, and he stumbled backward until he hit the kitchen counter. I didn't mean, he started, then stopped, running both hands through his hair. I just needed to feel something. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make this weird. He was talking fast now, the words tumbling over each other in his rush to explain, to take back what had just happened, to return us to the safe distance we'd maintained for so long. But I couldn't hear most of what he was saying because something inside me had cracked open, something that had been building pressure for weeks. The kiss hadn't been romantic or passionate or any of the things kisses are supposed to be in stories about people falling in love. It had been desperate and experimental and brief. It had been a test, a way for him to see if touching me, kissing me, crossing that boundary would make him feel something, anything, other than the numbness that had been consuming him for months. And the worst part was that it had worked. I could see it in his face, could see that for just a moment, he had felt something. Not love, not desire for me specifically, but relief. The simple relief of discovering that his capacity for feeling hadn't disappeared entirely. I realized I was staring at him, not saying anything, while he continued to apologize and explain and try to undo what had just happened. He was looking everywhere except at me, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. It's fine, I finally managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant even to me. You don't need to apologize. But that seemed to make it worse. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the moment he registered something in my expression that made him understand this wasn't fine at all. I have to, he said, and he was moving toward the door, grabbing his jacket from the hook by the entrance. I have to go for a walk. I need some air. Malcolm, I started, but he was already opening the door, already fleeing whatever he'd seen in my face that had scared him. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the picture frames on the wall, and I was left standing alone in our bright kitchen, still tasting bourbon and uncertainty on my lips. I stood there for a long time, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand why something I'd wanted so badly had left me feeling hollow and used and more alone than I'd felt in months. It wasn't the kiss itself that hurt. It was the reason behind it. The casual way he'd reached for me like I was a tool, something to be used to jumpstart his emotional system. The way he'd kissed me not because he wanted me, but because he thought I might be able to make him want something, anything. I'd spent weeks falling in love with him, weeks learning the texture of his silences and the weight of his trust, weeks believing that the intimacy we'd been building meant something real. But to him, I was just an experiment. A way to test whether he was still capable of feeling. When I finally went to bed, I could hear him moving around the apartment. He'd come back at some point while I was standing in the kitchen, lost in my own thoughts. I could hear him in his room, then in the bathroom, then settling onto the couch where he'd been sleeping more and more often lately. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of him trying to get comfortable, trying to sleep, trying to pretend that nothing fundamental had changed between us. But everything had changed. The kiss itself was just a symptom of something larger, something I should have seen coming, but had been too invested in my own feelings to recognize. Malcolm was reaching out, trying to reconnect with parts of himself that depression had made inaccessible. And I had been there, available and willing and stupidly in love, when he decided to test whether intimacy with another person could bring him back to himself. The problem was that what he needed, someone to help him feel human again, and what I wanted, someone to love me back, weren't the same thing at all. Maybe they never could be. By morning, we had both retreated into careful politeness. He made coffee without asking if I wanted any. I ate breakfast without offering to make him some. We moved around each other with the practiced precision of people sharing space, without sharing anything that mattered. Neither of us mentioned the kiss. Neither of us mentioned the way he'd fled or the way I'd stood there afterward, understanding too late that I'd been cast in the wrong role in his story of recovery. But something had broken open between us, and we both knew it. The careful balance we'd maintained, the slow build of intimacy we'd been constructing, all of it had been revealed as more fragile than either of us had realized. I started pulling away, not dramatically, not in a way that would force a conversation neither of us wanted to have, but gradually. I stayed later at school, spent more time in my room with the door closed, stopped lingering in the kitchen when he was there, stopped asking about his day, stopped offering pieces of my own. It wasn't anger that drove this retreat. It was self-preservation. The recognition that I had allowed myself to want something that was never going to be offered, had invested in a version of intimacy that existed primarily in my own imagination. Malcolm noticed. I could see it in the way he'd pause sometimes when I walked past him without stopping to talk, in the way he'd start to say something then stop himself. But he didn't push. Maybe he was relieved to have the pressure lifted, to go back to the safer distance we'd maintained before Maine, before the late-night conversations, before he'd asked me to help him feel something, and I'd foolishly thought he meant feel something for me. The distance I created between us became its own kind of presence in the apartment. Malcolm started noticing the way I'd slip out early in the mornings before he was awake, the way I'd come home later and later, the way I'd respond to his tentative attempts at conversation with polite but distant answers that closed down rather than opened up. I could see him trying to read the shift, trying to understand what had changed beyond the obvious. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me with a confused expression, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time and didn't recognize what he found there. Other times he'd start to approach me, then stop himself, as if he'd remembered something that made him reconsider. The careful ecosystem we'd built over months was collapsing, and we were both too proud or too scared to acknowledge what was happening. I knew I couldn't sustain this indefinitely. The apartment was too small for the kind of avoidance I was attempting, and the effort of being politely distant with someone I loved was exhausting in a way that made everything else in my life feel harder. My students noticed that I was distracted. My lesson plans became perfunctory. I stopped staying late to help with projects or answer questions. 3 weeks after the kiss, on a Thursday evening when I couldn't bear another night of careful silence, I wrote him a letter. I didn't plan to write it. I'd come home to find Malcolm in his studio, headphones on, working on something that filled the apartment with layered instrumental music that felt like longing made audible. I went to my room, ostensibly to grade papers, but found myself staring at a blank piece of notebook paper instead, trying to figure out how to explain something I barely understood myself. The letter, when it finally came, was shorter than I'd expected, more honest than I'd intended. Malcolm, I wrote, I wanted to help you feel something, but what I felt wasn't borrowed. It was real, and I don't know how to be around you without losing more of myself. I didn't explain what I meant by real, didn't elaborate on what I was losing or why being around him had become a form of self-erosion. I trusted that he was smart enough to fill in the spaces between my words, to understand what I couldn't bring myself to say directly. I folded the letter and left it on his desk, then grabbed my jacket and went for a walk. I didn't want to be there when he found it, didn't want to see his face as he read it, didn't want to have to manage his reaction or explain myself further. I walked for hours, through the neighborhoods surrounding ours, past coffee shops and bookstores and restaurants where other people were living their uncomplicated lives. I walked until my feet hurt and the sun had set, and I couldn't avoid going home any longer. When I got back, the apartment was dark except for a lamp in the living room. Malcolm's studio door was closed, but I could see light underneath it. The letter was gone from his desk. He didn't say anything to me that night or the next morning. We moved around each other with even more careful precision than usual, like we were both afraid that any accidental contact might trigger a conversation neither of us was prepared for. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the quality of his silence, in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The letter had created a new kind of space between us, not the comfortable distance we'd maintained before, but something more charged and uncertain. Over the next few days, I started noticing changes in Malcolm's routine. Small things at first. He stopped drinking the bourbon he'd been working through since the wedding. Started going to bed in his actual bedroom instead of falling asleep on the couch. I'd hear him on the phone sometimes, having conversations that sounded different from his usual work calls, more personal and probing. Then, about a week after I'd left the letter, I came home to find him gone and a business card on the kitchen counter. Dr. Sarah Chun, licensed clinical social worker. The card had been handled enough that the edges were soft, like he'd been carrying it around for a while before finally using it. Malcolm had found a therapist. I felt something loosen in my chest when I saw that card. Not relief exactly, but recognition. He was taking the letter seriously, taking himself seriously in a way I hadn't seen before. Instead of deflecting or making jokes or retreating into the emotional unavailability that had defined him for as long as I'd known him, he was actually engaging with what I'd written. The changes in him became more pronounced over the following weeks. He started asking me direct questions again, not the casual roommate questions about groceries and utilities, but real questions about my day, my work, my thoughts on things that mattered. When I'd give him brief, guarded answers, he didn't push, but he didn't retreat either. He just waited, with a patience I hadn't known he possessed. He started cooking dinners sometimes. Actual meals that required planning and attention rather than the takeout and frozen dinners we'd been surviving on. He'd make enough for two, but wouldn't explicitly invite me to join him. Just leave the second plate on the counter where I could see it, where I could choose to take it or leave it without either of us having to negotiate the gesture. I usually took the plate. One evening, I found him reading in the living room. Not scrolling through his phone or watching television with the distracted attention he usually gave to entertainment, but actually reading a book. Something thick and serious-looking that he was obviously absorbed in. "What are you reading?" I asked, the first non-essential question I'd asked him in weeks. He looked up, and I was struck by how different his face looked. More present somehow. Less defended. "It's about attachment styles," he said. "How the way we connect to people as children shapes how we connect to them as adults." My therapist recommended it. He held up the book so I could see the cover, and for a moment, something passed between us that felt like the beginning of a different kind of conversation. Not the careful small talk we'd been managing, but something more substantial, more real. "Is it helping?" I asked. He considered the question seriously, the way he'd been considering everything lately. "I think so," he said. "I'm starting to understand some things about myself that I've never understood before. About why I've been so afraid of wanting things, of needing people." He looked directly at me when he said this, and I felt that familiar twist in my chest, the one that reminded me why I'd had to create distance between us in the first place. But this time, instead of looking away or changing the subject or finding an excuse to leave the room, I held his gaze. "That's good," I said. "That's really good, Malcolm." And I meant it. Whatever happened between us, whatever became of the feelings I'd confessed in that letter, I genuinely wanted him to get better. Wanted him to figure out how to want things and need people and ask for what he required instead of using others as experiments in his own emotional recovery. 2 months after I'd left the letter, on a Saturday night when I was reading in bed, Malcolm knocked on my door. Not the casual knock he'd used when we were just roommates, but something more tentative, more respectful. When I opened the door, he was standing in the hallway in his pajamas, looking younger and more uncertain than I'd seen him since that first night when he'd asked me to help him feel something. "Can I stay?" he asked. The question was simple, but I could hear everything else underneath it. This wasn't the desperate request for emotional stimulation that his kiss had been. This wasn't him reaching for me because he needed to test whether he was still capable of feeling. This was something different, more intentional. He'd been working on himself, working on understanding why he'd been so afraid of connection, why he'd treated his own emotions like problems to be solved rather than experiences to be lived. And now he was asking, not for me to fix him or experiment with him or help him jumpstart his capacity for feeling, but for permission to see what might be real between us. to see if there was something underneath all the fear and numbness and careful distance that might actually be worth the risk of wanting it. I looked at him standing there in my doorway, and for the first time since that night in the kitchen, I felt something other than heartbreak when I looked at his face. I felt hope. "Yes," I said, stepping back to let him in. "You can stay." The weeks that followed moved differently than the months before. Slower, but more honest. Like we'd both stopped trying to rush towards something we couldn't name and started paying attention to what was actually happening between us. Malcolm didn't sleep in my bed that first night. Instead, we sat on my bedroom floor, backs against the wall, talking until the sun came up. About his therapy sessions and what he was learning about the difference between using someone and choosing them. About my own fears of being needed for the wrong reasons, of loving someone who might never be able to love me back in the same way. We talked about the kiss, finally. About how desperate he'd been to feel anything that wasn't numbness, and how I'd become a lifeline he'd grabbed onto without considering what that might cost me. About how sorry he was, not for the kiss itself, but for the way he'd used it as an experiment instead of a choice. I told him about the nights I'd watched him sleep, about the playlists he'd made that felt like love letters I wasn't supposed to understand, about the way I'd fallen in love with him gradually and then all at once, like a photograph developing in slow motion. He listened without trying to fix anything or promise anything or make declarations about what any of this meant for our future. He just listened, and somehow that was enough. In the morning, we made coffee together in the kitchen where he'd kissed me, and it felt different. Not charged with the tension that had been building for months, but settled. Like we'd finally stopped pretending we were just roommates and started figuring out what we actually were to each other. The changes were subtle at first. Malcolm continued with therapy twice a week, working through years of emotional avoidance with the kind of dedication he'd once reserved for his sound projects. I started staying home more, not because I was avoiding him anymore, but because I wanted to be there. Because our apartment had become a place where I felt safe to want things I'd spent my adult life protecting myself from wanting. We didn't rush into anything physical. The kiss had taught us both that intimacy without understanding was just another form of loneliness. Instead, we learned how to be present with each other in ways that felt sustainable, how to share space without losing ourselves in it. Malcolm started asking for what he needed instead of hoping I'd guess. When he was having a difficult day, when the weight of feeling everything after months of feeling nothing became overwhelming, he'd tell me instead of disappearing into his room or onto the couch. And I learned how to be supportive without trying to fix him, how to offer my presence without making it about my own need to be useful. I started asking for things too. For honesty when he was struggling. For patience when my own fears about being left made me pull away. For the kind of consistency that comes from choosing someone every day rather than just falling into proximity with them. Spring turned into summer, and we developed new routines. Malcolm would make coffee in the mornings while I graded papers at the kitchen table. We'd eat dinner together most nights, not because we felt obligated to, but because we discovered we enjoyed each other's company when we weren't trying so hard to maintain careful distance. We talked about the future in tentative terms. Not making promises we weren't sure we could keep, but acknowledging that whatever this was between us, it felt worth exploring, worth the risk of disappointment, worth the vulnerability required to let someone see you clearly and choose to stay anyway. 3 months after that first night, when Malcolm knocked on my bedroom door, I woke up to find him in the kitchen, humming softly while he made coffee. He was wearing one of my old sweaters, the navy blue one that had stretched out from too many washings, and his hair was still rumpled from sleep. When he heard me come in, he turned and smiled, holding up 2 mugs like an offering. "Morning, Jules," he said, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Contentment, maybe, or just the simple pleasure of being exactly where he wanted to be. I took the mug he offered and felt the warmth of the ceramic against my palms, felt the warmth of his fingers brushing mine as he handed it to me. Small gestures that had become meaningful not because they were dramatic, but because they were chosen, because they were real. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten so many careful meals in comfortable silence, where we'd maintained the polite distance that had kept us safe and separate for so long. But the silence between us now was different. Not empty or careful or charged with things we couldn't say. Just peaceful. The kind of quiet that comes when two people have finally stopped trying to be anything other than exactly who they are. Malcolm reached across the table and touched my hand, just briefly, just enough to connect us. His fingers were warm from the coffee mug, and when he pulled away, I felt the absence of his touch like an echo. We didn't need to say anything about what this meant or where it was going or what we were to each other now. We didn't need declarations or definitions or promises about forever. We just sat there as the morning light filled our kitchen, finally still, finally whole, not because we'd filled each other's emptiness, but because we'd learned how to hold it together, how to choose each other not as cures for our loneliness, but as companions in the ongoing work of being human. Outside, Chicago was waking up. Cars starting, people walking to work, the city beginning another day of its endless, complicated life. But inside our apartment, in our kitchen, with our coffee and our silence and our small, daily choice to stay, everything felt exactly as it should be. This was how love looked, I realized. Not like the movies or the songs or the stories I told myself about what I was supposed to want, but like this. Like two people who'd learned how to be themselves in the same space, who'd figured out how to want each other without losing themselves in the wanting. Like coming home to someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stay anyway. Like two mugs on a table and the promise of all the mornings still to come.